was it was before the lockdown. It was like in the fall before the lockdown. This this app company was wanting me to use their app, and their app was, well, you have students who are too afraid to ask questions in class, so you could track their questions on your app. I'm like, this, you're joking me, right? That you're kidding me, that this is, you're wanting me to be scanning my phone when I should be teaching. And instead of going, professor, I have a question, they're too scared. I'm confused by that. I do. I really, I just kind of tore into this guy. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me that you're making this up. This is you know, you're this is something, you're doing this for fun, aren't you? Are you kidding me? And there was like no, I got no response, and I guess that he was not doing this to make fun. He was doing this because it was serious. But the idea, that, okay, well, you're too timid to raise your hand in class. Well, I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, ask me questions. This is my job to any question you ask, I will answer. Now, other professors at FIT will say to them, figure it out. And I tell my students, okay, this is, figure it out is not an answer. Figure it out, you're well within your rights because you're paying for this. You're well within your rights to say, figure it out is not an answer. Say it respectfully. So I'm asking the question because I don't know. And I tell them, you can ask me any question. If I know the answer, I'll give you the answer. If I can make an educated guess, because I've done through this whole spectrum of construction, I can give you an educated guess on how I would approach it. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer, and I can call people. Threads Magazine. I know a lot of people I can call and get answers to different questions. So, the idea that, okay, they're too afraid to ask a question, not in my class, because I tell them, you're paying a lot of money for this, you're paying whatever. And I say, if you ask the question, more than likely someone else has the same question. They're just afraid they won't look cool if they ask it. So it's my job. You got to help me do my job. Part of helping me do my job is to ask me questions when you don't understand, because if you want to understand this, that's what I'm here for. So anyway, it's it's peculiar. It's a whole different thing these days than when I started there. So there you have it.
So, so can I take that opportunity to ask a question?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I've never done a full bust adjustment. I've read about them, but I didn't consider myself in need of one.
Okay.
And you were right. When I did it, it made a huge difference. Okay. But when I did it on my patterns, I failed to take into account on the ones I see online. Not only do you do the split from the shoulder down and pull, but you separate a piece on the lower right hand corner and bring it down so it's level. And I did not do that.
Okay.
So my pattern is kind of wonky, right?
Okay.
And so at this point, I thought I just need to retrace that front pattern, make the front pattern adjustment, cut the little piece out, and have a good clean pattern to start with. Is that correct?
Yes. See,
Okay.
I'm very big on, like, because see, if I'm doing something just for my uses, my patterns sometimes look like ransom notes. They're all pasted together. But I really believe in, if I'm going, like if I've got the pattern where I want it, I make a fresh copy. I want it clean, I want it pristine, then I throw away all of the excess stuff, because then you don't have to worry about being confused. You know that when you put that thing down on your fabric and cut it out, it's going to work. That's just, I think, the gold standard. Okay, so Lori, you have a question?
I just wanted to make a full bust adjustment suggestion. Like
Okay.
when I did mine, I cut it off at the waist, and I just worked with the piece above the waist, and then you're not trying to wrangle all this extra stuff. And when you get extra width, and you need to sort of bring it back so your waist size is the same. And if you cut it off at the waist, you can bring it back, and that extra you need to cut off will kind of reappear when you tape it back onto the lower half. It's just, I've done a lot of FBAs, and that's just my experience with something really long. Like I'm doing a tent dress. I cut it off just below the boobs and did it there and put it back, because you're wasting. It's just hard to wrangle with that much paper too.
That's
It's just
actually an
that's
excellent.
just a suggestion.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. So,
Okay,
so Kate,
thank you.
you understood, Kay, what she was talking about?
Cut it off at the natural waistline, do
Yeah.
my
And
front
then
bust
do everything
adjustment.
up, and then put the two pieces back together. That's a great.
Okay,
That's
and
excellent.
and then with the extra width that you get across there, just sort of smooth it back in at the waistline.
No,
Yeah.
what you do is you've got that chunk that's out to the
Right,
outside, right? Like you've got that chunk here, and that's the
right,
part where you need to cut and bring down. If it was a
right.
shirt like this, that's what I would do. But for something longer, just cut it off here, and then when you have to, this is out too far. You've added. You don't want to add to the waistline. You want to bring it back in. So just rotate your pattern back in to touch the vertical on the
Ah,
side. You may have to smooth something out here, but then you're gonna be back to the
ah,
regular waistline, and that will be cockeyed. That piece will be cockeyed, but it will probably be close to the right length that you want.
Hmm.
No, you're cutting
gotcha.
the extra piece gets cut off here. Sorry,
That's
but
brilliant,
just
brilliant.
keep it back onto the bottom half and not have to jigger with it too much. But
Thank you.
you'll have to fix the sideline a little bit because it will be canted in and it'll give it a bit of a different look. But I have to do an FBA on everything I make.
Okay, thank you so much. That was real helpful.
If it
Can I add one more thing?
doesn't make sense, you can get my information from Kenneth and I can try to talk you through it too.
Okay. Okay. So now, Jennifer, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, actually, this expands on it. First of all, Lori, that was great. So yes, I agree. But maybe Kenneth, this is more for you. I did
Okay.
mine and we talked about the dart being so wide.
Uh-huh.
But I think I'm still gonna go with it. But what about the actual, not width, the width? I'm supposed to take it in about what, maybe an inch and a quarter from the actual apex?
Generally, you mean the distance from the apex, or the take up of the dart itself?
No, the distance from the apex, because I have the dart.
Okay, the distance from the apex, as a general rule, the minimum is 1 inch, but the fuller the bust, the further away from the apex it can end. For a fuller bust, I would make it 2 inches from the apex.
Okay, so
And you could also do a little bit of shaping on those legs. They don't have to be stick straight because you're not stick straight there. So you could kind of have it kind of curve a little bit too and build in the shape there.
okay, that's good because I have it. It's the FBA, and then I figure I don't know where my apex is yet, but I do know I probably should bring it in just a little bit and start from there.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay, but I can still curve it. I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Good luck,
Okay.
Kay Ellen.
Okay. So Lori, yes,
Can I just add one more thing?
please do.
You want to do your FBA based on your apex. You want to hold that pattern up to you. This is very crude. You can measure, or you can, like, from where the neckline is, you can measure down to your apex, or I sometimes, if I'm in a hurry and really crudely, you hold the pattern up and you just draw it, and that's where you make your FBA to. You don't make it to the bust line on the pattern. You make it to your apex. So then, I mean, Kenneth has a brilliant way of moving that dart. Like, he taught me, and it's amazing.
Uh-huh.
But you want to try to do it. Start off with trying to do it to your own apex if you can. It's a lot less fiddly then and more accurate.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't
No,
mean
go
to.
ahead. No,
I
this
just
is all
have big
useful
boobs
information. Yeah, because ultimately, I want these coats to fit when it's done. I want you to have a coat that you're proud to wear, because one of the things I learned, my teacher Simone was very big on, if it doesn't fit, all of the good sewing in the world is not going to save it. So this is all very good information. So thank you all.
Could you tell them how to raise and lower the dart that you told me, because it was brilliant compared to what they're going to Google online? What you told me was just
Is
brilliant.
that like, slash it here and pull it up and add it here?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about it, if you would put like a slash line perpendicular to center, and it'll take it over to the side seam. And so if you want to raise that, you would just fold or overlap however much you need to raise it, and then below the dart, you make another slash over and add. So really what you're doing is you're just shifting this whole section up. That I found is much easier than other ways of doing it.
Online, they'll tell you to cut a box out and move it. It's a nightmare. Do
No.
what Kenneth said. he told me that, and it was just like a revelation, because I also have to lower darts. So
Well,
do what Kenneth said. He knows his
yeah,
stuff.
because you see this, there are, I, I was very spoiled when I got to, I'm sure I've told you all this before. I studied with a woman named Simone who trained at the École Guerlain in Paris. And of all my training, I regard that as my master's degree. I don't have a piece of paper for it, but I have the information and that's all I needed. And yeah, I learned a lot of these things from her because, her whole thing, really, she pounded it into our heads every single day of class. If it doesn't fit, it's a waste of time. And, so yeah. Okay, so other questions before we begin our work today, because where we're going today, we're going to add the sleeves and so forth. We're going to sew on the sleeves, sew on the collar, and then we're going to add the facing, or we're going to do the hemming first and facing. So those are the two, that's where we're going today. So other questions before? Okay, well then let's get started, shall we?
Actually, sorry, yeah, I do have a very quick question. On the welted pocket, which I put into my front, when you look at the inside, well, if you were to put your hand in the pocket,
Yes.
the top one is perfect.
Yes.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
The bottom one, I can see on both sides the welted side coming up. It's like tufty fabric.
Can you show me do you have the, now let's see what it looks like on camera.
I don't know if I can show you.
Oh, here we are.
But let me just see, which one was it? Hang on, that one's not actually that one.
I do love making welt pockets. I know that sounds like one of those crazy kooky. I also like sewing in diamond gussets, so I'm one of those guys.
Well, you make the making the welt pockets very, very easy.
Well, this is one of those, once you really kind of get what's going on and practice a couple times, they go in like that.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Okay, so what am I seeing here?
So the top part of the pocket is fine. It's
Okay.
where the lining meets the fabric.
Okay.
But here is the other side. So here we are, like that. It's just here along this line.
Okay, so what it looks like is that your seam allowance from your welt is showing through. Is that what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly
well,
that.
See, this is one of those times where you're going to cheat, because see, this is why you want to use the zipper foot, because the zipper foot would follow the cut edge of that welt, so you wouldn't catch the seam allowance in that seam. But what you can,
So I don't have a zipper foot that's like yours. Mine is a bit wider than yours. So I used my edge foot, which followed the welt very nicely. But I wonder if I made an error, because I had written in my instructions that the needle should be 1 millimeter away.
yeah, you want it to be.
And I think I put it towards the welt instead of
that's what happened.
Away from the welt.
Yeah, and so what you do, see, this is not fatal, because that seam is really going to hide inside. No, seriously, that's going to hide inside. So you know what I would do, and this is like,
you can't see it. You can't see it. I just know it's
exactly.
there.
So what you do is you get, on the top, you get the scissors and you trim that as close as you can get it.
Yeah.
And then from the back, you pick out the yarns.
The back, I pick out the yarns. What do you mean by that?
Okay,
That's the
as I
back.
understand it, yeah. What it looks like is you've got a little bit of seam allowance showing.
Yeah,
the front.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay. So what you want to do is you want to trim all of this as close to the stitching as you can get.
Yeah.
And then from the back side, just pull the yarns out.
Okay.
Because see, when you trim it close, that's gonna you can then just go.
Oh, I see what you mean. You mean the individual threads from the seam allowance. Okay, right.
What? You'll save it. No one will ever know. Your secret will be safe.
Yeah, I know. I just want to know really what I did wrong for next time.
Yeah, so next time, err on the side of being a little too far away from the seam allowance rather than too close.
Yes, I was right up against it. And then when I moved the needle a millimetre away,
yeah,
it was actually going through the edge of the seam allowance, which I thought was correct. But then afterwards I thought, that doesn't look right to me, but I didn't dare sort of do anything more with it really.
So are you good? We good?
Absolutely fine, thank you.
Okay,
Yes,
so,
I realise what I've done.
Okay, so now the next thing, we're going to be sewing this coat together. So let us begin. Here we are. And as always, I will ask if everyone can hear, because I want to make sure that this is working. As you can see.
Yeah.
Here.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're off and running. The back, this is the back. Here's the center back seam. I pinned the sleeve to the back at the raglan line. Now, again, see, this is where this comes in handy. I need to know which way is facing front so that this portion of the sleeve is the back, and I can pin it then to the raglan line. What I will do off camera, I'm going to pin the other sleeve to the other side and sew both of these seams. Then we will meet at the pressing table for the next step. So here we are at the pressing table. We press everything as sewn first. And then, since this is an inside curve, we're going to be pressing the seam allowances towards the sleeve. So what we want to do is we don't want to clip into this curve here, so we're going to stretch it opposite. And what that's going to look like is so by stretching that curve this way, it's going to open up that seam allowance and it will tip over quite nicely. So let me do the other side. This is the other raglan seam. This is just a little tip so that you don't have to clip into your seam allowance. It doesn't interrupt the seam allowance, it makes a stronger seam. Now next, I'm going to get out the sleeve board and I'm going to press the seams towards the sleeve. Now, before I press the seam allowances to the sleeve, I'm going to do a similar thing as I did at the neck earlier. I want to clip. This is at the underarm, the intersection where the raglan is going to meet the side seam. I want to press this open here and also up here. So this clip is about an inch down from the cut edge here. What this does is where you're going to be joining the collar and the facing, it reduces the bulk somewhat. So I'm going to press that open and then press the rest of the seam allowance towards the sleeve. So what that will look like here, just get this in range. There's that. And then bit by bit, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. And so here, this is where you're going to be glad you stretched this, because the seam allowance will lay flat now. And then again, that presses open right there. So there we are. I will go off camera and press the other side and meet you back at the work table. Here I have the sleeves sewn to the back panel. Now this is where I explain what I'm thinking here. I'm planning on top stitching this by hand. That is why I sew the back to the sleeves, because really what I have found is that when hand stitching, it's easier to roll the fabric up and sew the hand stitching when you have the sleeve joined to the back. If you join the sleeves to the front, you could do the same thing. But I find that it's easier joining the sleeves to the back, because once you have the front on, you can roll the fronts to the sleeves, but you can't roll the fronts to the sleeves to the back. It just makes hand stitching this seam allowance, or this seam, easier. So now I will go off camera and sew the same chain stitch with the ribbon floss to both of these seam allowances. And once I'm finished, I'll bring you back the results. So here we have the raglan seam with the ribbon floss chain stitch as the top stitch. Now you notice here at the underarm, I've stopped it about an inch below the seam allowance here. And as I have done on the other rows of the chain stitching, I've stopped it, about 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge, so that you don't have to worry about catching that into the seam or inadvertently clipping it when you install the collar. So the sleeves are sewn to the back. Now I will go off camera and sew the fronts to the sleeves and sew the chain stitch and bring you back.
Kenneth?
Yes.
Sorry. I just had a question. When I see when you're stopping, and I see why you're stopping your chain stitching about an inch from the edges like that. But if you were doing regular top stitching, would you do the same thing?
No, not necessary. You could take that all the way to the cut edges.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
So here I am, back from sewing the sleeves onto the fronts and sewing the top stitching. So it's starting to look like a coat. But one thing, before we sew the underarm and the side seam, we want to place the cuff latch. Now the cuff latch, there's a placement mark on the pattern. So what I do, I like to just mark it on the garment. So this is the lower mark on the pattern, and it is, if you need a number, 3.5 inches from the cut edge. And you can see here, what I've done is I've basted the cuff latch to the sleeve, pointing opposite. So that is what I will do over here. So here is the other cuff latch on the other sleeve, because once we have this position, we can then.
Opposite.
What's the question?
What do you mean by pointing opposite?
Okay, the cuff latches are going to point away from center.
Okay.
Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And which way? I'm sorry. One more quick question.
Underarm seam and the side seam.
No, I can see from the picture. It points up.
Yes.
The long point is at the top.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. Let me just place that right there. And you try to make it parallel to the cut edge. It's not going to really matter because it's just going to catch into the seam here. This is just to keep the thing from flapping around like a screen door. So really, I'm just going to So a tailor based. And this will hold everything together while I'm working. And there we are.
I'm sorry, one more question. I think I missed it. That is that at the is that covering the front of the sleeve, right? The sleeve front
That's
you put
correct.
that on? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, okay. Beautiful. Hang on, one. There we are. Okay. Thread. So here we are. The cuff latch is now secure. So really the next step I'm going to do off camera because there's no mystery to it. We really turn these inside out, pin from the cuff to the underarm and then down, and sew in one long seam. I will bring back the results. And here we have the main body of the coat sewn together. And you can see there's the cuff latch. It actually catches in the underarm seam. Ultimately, where this will go is this will fasten back with a button here. So there we have the underarm seams sewn. So since it's starting to look like a coat, the next thing the coat needs is the collar. That will be the next step.
How do we press those seams?
Yeah. I press them open.
Okay.
Yeah. We have the body sewn together. It's now time to put on the collar. So as you can see here, we have the collar already constructed. So we have a lot of work to do. Let's proceed. To begin, I've sewn 3/8 of an inch from the cut edge, because this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, all around the neck edge. All the way around. So you can see it catches the stay tape. I've narrowed down the seam allowances at the shoulders before I sewed to reduce some of that bulk. So we have the stay stitch of the neck so it doesn't stretch. Next, I'm going to be clipping before I start installing the collar. So really what you want to do is you just want to clip to the stay stitching. And these clips are, about 1/4 of an inch or so apart. You work all the way around. Here's the center back. And heading over to the front panel. So here we are. All of our seam allowances clipped. From here, I'll bring in the collar and we'll start pinning the collar to the body. Here is center back seam right here. And so how I visualize this, I have to get oriented. So let's see, there, that is the center back seam on the collar. And again, have to get oriented here. There we are. There is the center back seam on the body. No, actually, it's right there.
So now it's going to look a little wonky because we have top stitched over here, but there's the actual center back seam on the body itself. So now, see, ultimately, you want these two to match, and so you put the under collar, right side, to the right side on the body. Now I'm going to, foolishly, I put these pins in upside down. So these two will match. And so you pin them one on top of the other. Like so. From here, you work out one side. And notice I'm pinning perpendicular here. This is because I'm going to thread base this. So I don't have to worry about any pulling out of pins when I go to the machine, because there will be no pins as I go to the machine. So I find it's easier to find the dead center back and work my way out from the center outward. So what I will do is continue pinning this and go off camera and pin the other side, and I will bring you back the results. See you in a few moments.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
As you're pinning the collar to the body of the coat, you're treating the collar as one unit, or are you just pinning the under collar to the neck edge?
Well, you want to pin the entire collar to the neck edge. One of the things we did when we made the collar is we sewed a machine based.
Yes.
We sewed all the layers together. So yes, you just treat it
making
all as one.
Thank you.
Okay.
Almost done. Okay, so now that we have it pinned, because like I said, we started in the center back and we worked this way, you want to check it to make sure the collar is on completely centered. And this is how I do it. What I'll do is I'll come here, I'll match these two edges and see if the edges of the collar land at the same place, because you want the distance from the end of the collar to the corner to be consistent on both sides. And if you check, yes, they both hit. So that means this collar is placed properly. So from here, what I'm going to do here is to thread based. Now this is one of those times when I will thread based here.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you did not pin it all the way to the edge?
Well, we pinned, this is the end of the collar itself.
Okay, that's the,
And so
okay,
then this
sorry.
is the lapel portion.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay.
The machine. I will thread based on top of the stay stitching. So this is all going to be about 1/8 of an inch inside the seam line. So it will be all okay. And using the same color as what you have in the machine means that if you really don't want to rip it out, you can sort of not rip it out. I know I'm speaking heresy here, but okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to make you watch me sew this whole thing. I'm going to go off camera and sew the rest, and I'll meet you back here. Almost finished. Okay, so I will secure the thread. There we are. So everything is basted on. And one more check. I just like to make completely sure that these are even. So what I'm doing here is I'm matching the two ends of the body, and I just want to make sure that both ends of the collar are at the same point, and they are. So now I'm going to run over to the machine. And when I sew, I'm going to sew with the stay tape up, and I'm going to sew again right on that stay stitch. I'm not going to sew the final seam yet. I'm going to be sewing at 3/8 of an inch, and that will solidify the collar. So I will bring it back when I'm done. And here the collar is set on. Next step, before the facing, we're going to be addressing the hem. But at this point, let's just enjoy the work that we've done.
Okay, so questions. Crickets, crickets, everyone. Yeah. Okay, so we have the collar on. And you notice, you know, I've said this before, like a lot of times I tend to baste with what's in the machine, because that way, you know, especially if you need to baste on a stitching line, later on, if you have to take the basting out, you don't leave any bits there, and any bits that are caught in the stitches, no harm, no foul. No one will know. If you sew with a white basting thread, you end up picking all those stitches out and they never completely come out. So that's why I like to sew my basting with whatever's in the machine. It's a cheat, but hey, it works. Okay, you with me so far?
Plus, you don't have to unthread and rethread your machine.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yes, you know, well, you see, I'm very big about I want there to be as little work as possible, because there's plenty of work to go around when you're working on anything. So again, don't put your time where it doesn't show. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be addressing is hemming and the facing. So let us just continue on. Here we are.
I have cut enough bias strip.
And we can hear this? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
To interface the cuffs. The bias strips are 2 inches wide. They're cut out of the tailoring canvas. And I have also cut enough length to interface the hem. Now, if you have a half yard of the canvas, you may have to splice to make one long continuous strip for the hem. So this is how I do it. I like to use bias strips and a piece of silk organza. So what this will look like here, when we join the two, we actually want to join it on the grain. So happily, this particular canvas has the lengthwise grain as part of the weave. So it's a little easier for me to show you. So what we want to do is we have this cut on the lengthwise grain. And so we want the grain lines to face the same way. And so here, again, we cut these on the straight grain. So what we'll do here, in this, or we put the edges together and we pin the organza over. Now the organza doesn't have to be on the bias. I like an organza rather than muslin because you don't want to create stiffness. You just want to create a join. And if you have a little bit down here or up here that you need to level off later, not to worry. But the object here is you want these two sitting edge to edge underneath the organza. So now that we have this finished, we're going to go over to the sewing machine to sew. So here we are under the machine, and you can see the cut edge. So we're going to be using a serpentine stitch. You could use just a straight zigzag if you wish. The width on the serpentine is 5.0 and the length is 1.0. You want this fairly short. We have motorcycles outside. Didn't know that my neighborhood was a haven for motorcycles. As you can see, I'm making sure that both these cut edges match. Turn it around. Again, turn it back around. So we're sewing first right down the cut, and then either side. Show you the result here. There. And that's what it looks like on this side. So what's nice about it is you don't necessarily get a hinge because the first row of stitching straddles the two joins. From here, I will take this over to the pressing table and press it, and I will meet you back at the work table. So the strip is pressed. Now, I'm going to trim this off here and here. And flip it over. Trim off the excess there and here. So we have a join that doesn't create a hinge, and it's nice and flat. Let's trim that down a little bit there. Nice and flat. It doesn't add any bulk. This will not read through the hem allowance. We have our strips prepared. Voila. Next, we go to the coat. Here we have the coat on the table. And you can see here, I'm drawing a line. And this is going to be where the hem allowance folds. Now I'm over here. I've worked ahead, as you can see. So let me explain here. This is the stitching line for the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now the facing is going to end somewhere out here. So you need a little extra of this hem allowance to tuck in behind the facing. So this here blends to the 1.5 inch hem allowance. So that's really what I'm doing here is I'm just marking that 1.5 inch hem allowance.
So you're marking at 1.5 inches on the fold line?
Yes. Yeah, that is going to be where the bottom edge of the coat, the finishing edge.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Opposed to a disappearing chalk. This is on the inside, and I want those marks to stay put until I get everything situated. So here, that is the cut edge. So that's going to be the folded edge. So what we want to do here, I'm going to come back over here. Let's just rearrange this. There we are. What I want to do with my bias strip is I'm going to cut this off perpendicular. And I'm going to bring it here. And I'll stop at about 1/4 of an inch. Well, it'll be about 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge. So pin this so that the cut edge of the bias strip is on the chalk line. This is step 1. So we're almost to the end. And so here I'm going to cut the other end, about 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge. You don't want it to go all the way up to it. So now that we positioned it, next we will baste. Now the basting, this is just going to hold the strip in place until we have it all sewn in. But what I'm going to do here, as you can see, I'm just doing a tailor baste, sewing a tailor baste about 1/2 inch up from the cut edge. We just want to hold that down. Okay, almost done. Here we are. From here, what I want to do, I'm going to get a needle and thread and bring it back, and I'm going to catch stitch this upper edge just about the width of the facing. I don't want this to curl over time, so just catch stitching it up here for now. It will keep it nice and tidy. So I will be right back with the needle and thread. So really, this isn't a lot of catch stitching, and obviously you want to use a very light tension so that this doesn't read through to the front. But you just want to hold that edge up behind the facing. So I want to do this on both ends of this strip. And I will sew this one here and come back when I have the other one sewn. So I will finish this one here and then sew the other one off camera, bring it back, show you the results.
Kenneth, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Are you're catching the canvas on the bottom, and are you just catching a very hair of the front? Because some of us may not have the interfacing it.
Yeah. So if you use a fine needle,
Okay,
and just pick up one thread.
got it. Perfect.
And make a very, very light tension.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
There we are. That is what it's going to look like up close. You can see, not terribly short stitches, just to hold this up. So I'll return with the other side sewn. So here we have the other end of this strip catch stitched to the body. Now, before I go any further, one thing I like to do is to thin out the seam allowances here. So if you cut these down to about 1/4 of an inch, this is a form of grading. So the object here is that you want this portion of the hem allowance to be a little narrower than this so that you don't have seam allowance laying over seam allowance. Then over here, same thing. Just trim those down to about 1/4 inch. So we have reduced bulk. Wherever you can reduce bulk, that's a good thing. Okay, so next we are going to pin the hem allowance up and fold it. We're going to fold it right on the cut edge of the bias strip. I'm not going to take this all the way over. I'll probably take it over to midway between the side seam and the front. But the beauty here is having this bias strip is going to help you fold, because the fabric will naturally want to fold on that cut edge. So I'm going to stop it right about 2 inches away, because we have to put the facing on. So this will help us get some of the hem done before we actually put on the facing. So I will go off camera, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin this up and then I'm going to baste it, because the next step is hand stitching. So I'll bring it back, pinned and basted. Almost done. What I'm showing you, I'm going to show you this here. This is what's called an uneven basting stitch. You leave about 1 inch or so, and then you stitch 2 running stitches. We're almost done. Then I'll explain the beauty of the uneven basting stitch. The beauty of the uneven basting stitch, if you have 2 short and 1 long, yeah, you have the 2 short and 1 long, if you clip every other long basting stitch, it's easier to pull the basting out. So now the hem is basted. What I will do next is to sew a hemming stitch. Now I'm going to be using orange thread for this, but it won't show because I'm going to catch it to the interfacing here. This is the stitch that I like because it works so nicely and it doesn't show from the front. So I'll go get some orange thread and come right back. So we're ready here to sew the hemming stitch. This is why I baste, because I find it's easier to baste, to hold everything together, than trying to dodge around pins. So the stitches themselves are going to be about 1/4 inch from this cut edge here. So what I like to do is fold this back. And so I'm going to come out. Now this is, you come out through and you just catch 1 or 2 yarns of your fabric. And then you don't go through the fabric again, you just go straight back. This is all stab stitches. And you want the tension fairly loose here. So you just barely catch. And these stitches are about 1/4 inch apart. So again, just barely catch. Now the thinking behind this, the rationale behind this, is that if you were to use a catch stitch, what happens is that the catch stitch will pull the face fabric up over the cut edge. In this stitch, the catch stitch, or the stitch, sits on the same plane as the bias strip. So there's no tug against the fabric. The two surfaces are pretty much flat. Now in a boucle, you could sew this with Frankenstein stitches and no one would know. But if you're sewing, say, a gabardine, you will truly appreciate this because it doesn't really read through the fabric. Feels like watching paint dry, but I'm going to sew just a few more. Get past this seam here. So yeah, about 1/4 inch from the cut edge of the hem allowance, and just barely catch. So it's when you go in through the hem allowance, you pick up just that 1 or 2 threads. Now, if you're hemming a fabric that, like a gabardine, that really shows, one thing I like to use is machine rayon embroidery thread because it's finer. And I like also to use a number 10 beading needle. They're sharp, they're thin, they make it so that you can pick up one yarn of the fabric from behind and you get a minimal show through. Okay, I will go off camera and finish this and bring it right back. That's what it looks like from here. It's a little curvy because I'm doing this through the computer. See? You don't see anything on the face. I will return with the finished stitching. Okay, finished. So now let me pull out here, show you the result. Here you are. And show it from the other side. Even with the orange thread, it doesn't really show. Again, I've got a little dispensation because I've used a backing on this, but it doesn't show. Now next, I'm going to take out the basting. This is where I'm going to show you about the uneven basting, how wonderful it is. So we have a long one here. We cut this one. Long one here, cut this one. Long one here, cut this one. So you just there you go. That's how it works. I will remove the rest of the basting and meet you over at the pressing table. So here we are with all of the basting on this section removed. I've left the basting here until later when I attach the facing. But a lot of this you can remove beforehand, and then you just want to steam it over the ham. Okay. Here we are. You steam it into the shape that the coat forms when you wear it. So the combination of the bias strip and the stitching and the steaming will make it so that it doesn't create unsightly points. I don't like a hard press on here. It's considered bad form if you have a crease along this line. So you can see I'm just steaming and finger pressing. So I'll give you a little close up on that so you can enjoy it. See how beautiful. And there is the inside. From here, we install the facing.
So I'm going to stop here for a moment and see if there are any questions.
Yes. You didn't steam that at all once you basted that hem up.
No, no,
Okay.
I like to get everything sewn and then take all the basting out and then steam, because depending on the fabric, you run the risk of leaving some marks with basting.
Oh, true.
Yeah, I mean, if you really, if you wanted to do some steaming before you actually sewed the hem up, you could use a fine rayon machine embroidery thread for your basting, and that is less likely to leave marks on the fabric.
Thank you.
Okay, so other questions?
Just to double check, the catch stitching was just from the center front to like 3 inches from the side seam?
It's about 5 inches. It's the width of the
5
face.
inches?
Yeah, so
Oh, the width of the facing.
yeah,
Okay.
it's about that distance to that distance there. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So now, on we go.
This is a long view of the coat. So what I'm doing here is I'm pinning all the way around, but I'm not pinning the lower portion that blends with the hem. As you can see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. As you can see, the collar is between the facing and the body of the garment. So it's pinned right now. What I like to do is I like to hand baste with the thread that I will be using in the machine. That way you don't have to worry about dodging around the pins. It just makes everything a little easier when you're handling this. I will go off camera and do just that. So here we're coming to the end of the facing. And now you'll see why I like to base these in 2 different halves. At this point, we want to smooth the facing out. And then we want to pick this up by 1/4 of an inch. Now you've built this in because if you notice when you pick this up, these 2 edges meet. But I just like to ensure that that extra 1/4 of an inch is there before I pin and sew the 2 lower ends of the facing. I just find that's insurance. And so yes, when this is
Kenneth, I have a question.
a little bit of a wobble.
Where exactly did you pick up the 1/4 of an inch?
Okay, let me run it back a little because see this little ripple here?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that you just pick that up to see what you're going to see. That these are going to
Okay.
match because we built it into the pattern. But I just want to make sure that that little ripple is there. Because see, if you don't need it, you don't have to worry about it. But if you do need it, it's there.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Now this extra here, if you don't need it, it will take care of itself. But if you do need it, you will be glad you have it. Otherwise, what you're going to have to do is to take this out and let it out slightly. So I will baste this then. And then, once this is basted, we will be ready to go to the machine. So I will baste this end, I will prepare the other end, and I will bring this back here to the work table before we go to the machine. So here we have the facings all basted into place. And our next step really will be sewing this. I'm not going to make you watch me sew this because it's pretty straightforward. You sew everything at 1/2 inch. However, I'm going to show you some details once we get to the pressing table about sewing. I decided actually to show you what I'm going to do on the lower ends of the facing. So we're going to continue sewing to the corner. turn this over this way to sew the lower ends. See, this way we can get the stitch because we start the stitching where the facing begins, which is right about there. So I'm going to put a pin. So that's where the edge of the facing starts. And so we will use the line we drew earlier. There we are. To begin our stitching. Use that as our stitching line. That way we don't end up catching this by a strip of canvas. We can sew right next to it. And now what we can do is this corner here, shorten that stitch down to 0.75. So right to that row of stitching. Stitch a couple across, and then sew up about 3/4 of an inch. And that then will reinforce that corner. Turn this a little bit, pull it out a tiny bit, so you can see what I've done here. Let's turn it from this side. So you can see I started the stitch right there. And we sewed along that line you drew right outside the canvas over to this stitching line, and then sewed the corner. And there you have it. Now we'll go to the pressing table. So here we are at the pressing table, and what I've done here is I folded, there's our center back seam. I folded on the center back to see that, okay, our two collars are the same. And then I also wanted to just check to make sure that the distance from the collar to the intersections is the same. Because at this point, you can take the seam out, let the seam in a little bit to make sure that both of these corners match. It's much more difficult once you've pressed and turned it right side out. So that's a little bit of insurance I like to take before I start pressing and clipping. As always, we press it as sewn before we go any further, which I will do off camera. This is now where we get the point presser and press all of the seam allowances open. On the corners here, as I did on the collar, much easier to press everything open first before we trim the corners. So again, I will go off camera and press all of these seam allowances open and return back here. And here we have last pressing. So back to the work table. Here we are back at the work table. And one thing I have done here, you can see, I have marked where the top button is, because what we want to do, we're going to be clipping our corners. We will be clipping the curves at the neck because everything is sewn. And then we will be grading the seams. it's at the hem. So I work up front. I know this seems heavy going, but it's good to see how this trims. So now we're getting close to this point here. So then we taper off to nothing right there. So if you look at the seam allowances, you can see this tapers off to nothing, within a ½ inch of this mark here. So now I'm going to flip the work over. And we're going to trim starting here, and this is on the body side. We will trim that same ¼ inch. See, the object of grading is that the public side has the wider seam allowance because it pads out the narrower seam allowance underneath. Okay, so here we are. And so this then tapers nothing there. Now we are ready to press. So here we are at the pressing table. As you can see, I've worked ahead and I'm turned one of the facings right side out, and I will turn the other facing right side out before we press. Really, the techniques that we used when we constructed the collar, we're going to be using on this as well to get the sharp corners, so I won't really repeat them here. So I will go off camera and turn this facing right side out, and we will begin to press.
Kenneth, I have a question.
Yes.
So when you're grading the seam allowance on the sides, are you grading them both, or did you just say just the top or the bottom?
It's just what the theory is behind grading the seam allowances, because you don't want them both the same width, because when you press, they will read through. So the rule is the outward facing side is the wider seam allowance. So on the body below the button, the outward facing side is the body. So that is the seam allowance that's wider, so you would trim the facing narrower. When you have the lapel that turns back, the face of the lapel, which is on the facing, faces out. So above the button, the facing has the wider seam allowance and the body has the narrower one.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
And
yes,
so
it does.
the technical term is the public side and the private side. But you could think of it as the outward facing side and the not outward facing side. Okay? Okay, so let us continue.
Kenneth,
Yeah.
your top button seemed to be quite low down. My top button is very high. Does that matter?
No, it really doesn't. I just made an executive decision based on this particular woman. It felt, if it was a little too high, it felt like it didn't look well on her figure. So you can move that up or down as you feel necessary.
So the lapel thing will still work even though I've got a very high top button.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Phew.
Okay.
Phew. Thank you.
Okay.
So here we have the facings all basted into place. And our next step really will be...
Hang on, I think I jumped back a little bit, so. There we are. Okay. It's looking a little strange there. Okay. Here we are. Sorry.
So when I press this, it works best to give it some steam. And finger press it just to get everything set. And also, you just want to make sure you don't press any more creases into this than you need to. So here. And there we are.
Kenneth, may I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
So when you're pressing so that to favor a seam,
Yes.
I'm sure it depends on the thickness of the fabric, but
Yes.
are there golden rules as to how much favoring
The
you?
general rule would be, say, 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch.
So a lot.
Yeah, yeah, because you can see here, right along there's the stitching line. The object is you just want to make it appear to be a folded edge from the outside. And so since we have built the favoring into the pattern, this should automatically want to favor on its own.
Yeah.
But as you know, when you're steaming and kind of getting everything ready for the final press, you can help it along. But the rule of the general rule is 1/8 of an inch.
Regardless of the thickness of the fabric.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, if it's a thicker fabric, you could go maybe 3/16 or 4 millimeters, but I wouldn't go much past that. Okay?
Thank you. Yeah.
Now, this is where the clapper comes in. I explain to my students at FIT that the reason you would use a clapper as opposed to putting the iron down is if you don't want to put shine on your fabric. Also, when you're pressing, you want the heat and the steam to saturate into the fabric, but then you want natural materials, wood, cotton, to draw the moisture and heat away. That is the premise behind the clapper. So I'm just going to work my way up. It's a little slow going, but we'll enjoy it here. And so there's the top button. So we're going to stop pressing. This is the first step. Now, I'm going to show you what you're looking for. See how that seam rolls ever so slightly back? That's what you want. You don't want the seam sitting dead on that edge. You want it to roll slightly back. You've built that into the pattern. This is where we exploit that in the pressing. Now, like I said, I like working in sections here. So what I will do now is I have my basting thread in the needle, and I like to just sew a tailor baste to hold this edge. And you don't have to worry about it flapping around so much. Now, coming up to here, again, you want to see where your mark is, because that's where we're going to stop the basting, or a little bit before. You could stop it a couple inches below. But you just want this all to be secured. So there we are. It favors to the facing. Next, I want to press this above. Now that we have the lower half of the facing sewn, we're going to press and baste the lapel portion. So this is where the sleeve board comes in. We want the seam to favor back when we're steaming and pressing. And so again, I like to work it in sections. Also, the beauty of steaming this over the sleeve board is you can build a little bit of roll into this. So now, that's what we're going to do. And to crisp up that corner, again, with the pressing cloth this time because I don't want to mar the fabric. There you go. And as we like to let that cool, and then we want to tailor base this as well. See, ultimately, I'm going to top stitch around this edge, but I want to have everything pressed and basted in place so that nothing shifts before the top stitching gets sewn. And then just turn the corner here. Next, I will press the facing back along the neck seam. Now we want to press the seam allowances on the neck seam down. I will press first and then I will understitch later. So this is where the clapper really comes in handy. Sorry, I'm blocking that. And having the sleeve board is going to be a really handy tool because you can really place this so that the shaping at the shoulders is accurate. And there's no race here. You can steam it, finger press it, you can come in, press it with your clapper. The object here is to have all of the seam allowances facing down. So I will go off camera.
I have a question.
Finish this.
Yes.
So did you trim or grade those seam allowances at the collar at all? It just seems like there would be a lot of.
I graded a little bit, yes. And I did clip the collar somewhat so that everything would spread out.
Yeah, okay.
And so what I'm going to be doing in the next step is I'm going to be sewing all of the seam allowances to the facing with a pick stitch, understitching. So that will also help control them.
Thanks.
And bring you back the result. Almost done. There we have it. Now, that is the seam pressed. Our next step is going to be going to the work table to pick stitch the seam allowances. So here we are back from the pressing table, and I have threaded up a needle with Mara 30, the top stitching thread. What we want to do now is we're doing what's called understitching. So we're going to pick stitch the seam allowances to the facing. Now, for this particular fabric, you're never going to see it because the texture is so high. But it's just good to show you. So pick stitch is a little tiny back stitch. And if you're working on a fabric that has a smooth surface, these will read like little dots. So obviously spacing is key. And so really, you want to stitch this, I'd say about 1/4 inch from the seam. Now what I'm doing is I'm sewing just the seam allowances. You don't want to catch the main body. Now this functions the same way as understitching a facing on a neckline. That's the same principle we're doing here. This will keep all the seam allowances where we want them. So I will, can't seem to hit the frame here. So as you can see, it doesn't really show. So I will go off camera and sew the rest of this and bring you back the result. Okay, almost done. One more. And back through into here. And secure the thread. So the beauty of this, you can see right now, is that it flattens out this seam and keeps all the seam allowances in place. So there we are. Next, we're going to finish the hem. Now here we have just this little bit of hemming to do before we're finished with this video. Now, aren't you glad that you did all of this beforehand? So really, you're going to pin this up. I like to baste. I know some people think I'm a little persnickety that way, but really, I don't like catching my sewing thread on pins, so I find it very annoying. So there we have this. Now, really, if you remember the stitch we sewed this with, you're going to sew the same stitch. Now, I stop it about 1 inch from the edge of the facing. So from here to here, I will sew with the hem stitch. I will also use the orange thread so you can see what I've done, but I will do that off camera because you've seen that already. And I will return with the finished result. And there we have it. We also have dueling sirens outside. I don't know what that's about, but this is New York. So again, you can see that I've stopped this about 1 inch from this facing here. I will remove the thread basting and we will go to the pressing table for one final press. So as always, we press on the pressing ham and just a little bit of steam. See, it makes a nice curve. And just continue that press around. Allow it to cool. And while I'm here, what the heck, let's just press the other end because I have already sewn that. There we go. I'll let this cool for a moment and I will meet you back at the work table so we can survey the results. And suddenly, it looks like a coat. Now, what I'm planning on doing is I am planning on top stitching the fronts, but I will sew those off camera. But you can see the facings are on, the hem is finished, and once the fronts are top stitched, the next lesson will be installing the lining and finishing.
Okay then, so are you all like aching with fatigue?
Oh, it's wonderful.
It is wonderful. Where the facings met at the top
Yes.
under the collar, I must have missed that bit, but how did you join them? Because they're two bits, aren't they?
Well, there's a little
separate bits.
crescent.
So they just meet in the middle and you just sew them up.
Well, no, the facing comes up and it has a seam at the shoulder, and then there's like a little half section. Because we did that in the last video, in the parts and pieces video, where you know that you have two facing pieces. You have the one with the body, and it has the little curve there, and then you have the curve at the back, and so they sew at the shoulder seam.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
What was that flappy bit then underneath the collar?
That was the facing. That was the back neck facing.
Do I have one of those?
Yes, you do.
Do I?
Yes.
Thank God for that.
Your pattern. I know for a fact it was included. So yes, you might want to go look at the pattern and see, and also go back to the one parts and pieces, because the show, you know, because I get confused, so I always lay it out. You know, it shows the little the crescent facing for the back, and then the two fronts.
Oh, I definitely have done that for the lining.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, I definitely did that.
The lining is different, but
I should have done also for the fabric. Yeah, okay, I better look that one up. I don't think I've seen that.
Okay. So yeah. So Lori, yes, question.
With the top stitching, because I have like the way I want my coat to be, I want to be able to fold it out so you see the top stitching, but I also want to be able to button it at the top.
Uh-huh.
I just sort of top stitch. You want to top stitch obviously I could top stitch all the way on the outside, and then where it rolls out, then just sort of top stitch from below the button up and around on both sides, and only go through one side at a time.
Well, what I did on this coat, it was a little bit of a cheat because she's planning on wearing it open all the time. And so what I did is a machine based, you know, on the top stitching. And so on this portion here, I sewed the chain stitch down to a little bit below the button and then continued it all the way down. But on the body side, I just ran the top stitching up about so far so that when the lapel folded over, you didn't have the chain stitching showing on the back of the lapel. Another thing you could do is do a machine based and then sew the chain stitching on both sides so that it will read properly from both sides. But if you're using a machine top stitch, I would, you know, this is where if you can get your hands on one of those 301A, or if you have a Singer featherweight, it does exactly the same thing. I would sew all the top stitching with the featherweight because the top stitching then looks the same from both sides.
May I ask one more question?
Yeah, please do. Yes.
How much ribbon floss does it take to like a coat, how much top stitching or how much ribbon floss would you need?
You know, I honestly don't know how to calculate yardage. I have just this big bolt of it. But so what I would say is make a sample. Say you have like 1 yard of ribbon floss. So and see how much it reduces down to. That's how I would calculate that. Yes, Ruth.
Hi. Yeah, I have held off on doing the last bound buttonhole up at the lapel.
Okay.
Okay, it's because it's going to flip out like this, right?
Yes,
So
right.
essentially it's going to be on the facing material.
That's correct. Yes.
So at this point, when I'm putting everything together, just before I sew the rest of the face or start to sew the facing on, should I just do that buttonhole at this point?
Well, I would put the buttonhole where you want it on the facing before you put the facing onto the garment. Much easier than dragging all this stuff around. And so after once we've got this far, then to finish the back of the buttonhole, I would finish it at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because then you know exactly where it is. It's not going to shift. You don't have to worry about like marking it and then missing it by 1/4 inch.
Great. So pretty much at any point before I start attaching that facing, I can do the bound buttonhole on the facing side and then of course wait till it's all put together to do the back.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So other questions? Allie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm a little bit lost. So within the videos, which part are we supposed to finish the buttonholes at?
So if you're using just machine buttonholes, you don't have to worry about that right now.
I did bound buttonholes.
Okay, the bound buttonholes. Okay, so now at this step, if you made the bound buttonholes on the coat, this is where you finish the backs of the buttonholes right at this point.
Okay. Okay. So after we sew the facing to the center front, but before we do anything else.
Well, you want to get to this point. You want to get the facings on. You want to get it pressed. It's good to base that edge to make sure that you know that everything's going to fall there. After that, then you finish the backs of the buttonholes.
Oh, okay. So after after the top stitching?
You could do it after the top stitching. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. After the.
Yeah. I mean, you could do it now, or you could do it after the top stitching.
Oh, okay.
But you see, the thing is, you don't want to try to finish them too soon. But if you get to this point in your coat where we're at now, where we stop now, this would be a good time to finish the backs of the buttonholes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, Lori.
That bound buttonhole on the point of the lapel that I'm gonna have. I should do it opposite when I make that one, and then probably finish the other side square rather than oval, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Yes. Then it will read the same from both sides.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Other questions?
So the front side should be the facing side.
That's correct. Yes. Because as a rule, you're going to be wearing it with the facing turned out. But if you want to, bring it, close it, the back of the buttonhole will read just fine if you finish it square as opposed to oval.
Thank you.
Okay. So other questions?
Can I ask you, sorry,
yes,
if you're
please.
doing machine top stitching?
Yes.
Can you just do it from the front side until you reach that turn at the top button? And finish it and then flip the garment so that is that how you would compensate if you don't have the fancy machine?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but I know, of course, it's easy for me to say because having machines is part of my business. But honestly, when I got that machine, and I knew because I tried it on the little featherweight, the Singer featherweight. Just having one of those machines has not made me afraid of top stitching anymore, because as much as I adore my Bernina, and I do, I love it, I love it, I love it. I would go into a burning building to save it. It does not like top stitching thread. It just does not. And everyone says, well, you don't have it cleaned right, or you don't have it blah, blah, blah. No, it doesn't like top stitching thread. So I have a machine that is a dedicated top stitching machine. But that's, because I do this for a living. So it's, it's a business expense. Okay, so yes, Ruth. Turn your microphone on.
Sorry. Yeah, in terms of the top stitching, I only have a Bernina. I
Yeah.
don't have a featherweight, so I'm going to be using the machine to do that.
Yes.
And I've never used top stitching thread, so if it doesn't like that.
Well, you know what you can do. The workaround is to thread two of the same thread through your needle.
Oh, okay.
And since it's gonna you're gonna have to flip it anyway. Where you want the face, you have two threads, and the stitch length go fairly long, like 4.5. Make a test before you commit to it, but a longer stitch reads better. And so then when you want to top, like if you're stitching here and you want the top stitch is going to end here, where this turns into the facing, what you're going to do is you're going to bury both ends in between the layers of fabric. So you would just thread them in a needle and thread them into the fabric and just trim off the ends. And so then you could start, face up going below. So you would sew it in 2 passes. Did that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah, because you're going to here to here, down to wherever this turns. Then you're going to stop. Then you're going to bury those thread ends. And then you're going to sew from the face from there down or there up, whichever. So you're going to sew it in 2 different steps. You can't do it all in one go.
Right. Okay. That helps.
Because I have tried threading 2 threads in the bobbin. Doesn't work. So, but 2 threads in the needle is going to give you something that will show quite nicely.
Okay. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay. So who else? Who else has? Yes, Vivian.
Vivian, yeah. So I actually purchased embroidery machine thread because I liked the colors and it had a little sheen.
Okay.
What's the difference between that and top stitching thread?
Well, top stitching thread is it's like a buttonhole thread. It's fairly heavy. It's
heavier than the embroidery thread, which is heavier than the regular.
Well, there's regular machine thread, and there is a numbering system for diameters. I don't know what it is. I just point and say I want that. Machine embroidery thread as a rule is thinner than a top stitching thread.
Okay.
If you're, if hand embroidery thread, if you have those little hanks, you get like 6 plies, you can peel it down to 3 or 2 or whatever. So a machine embroidery thread as a rule is thinner than what you normally sew garments with. Buttonhole thread, Mara 30 is a buttonhole thread, top stitching thread, tends to be a little thicker in diameter.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So other questions? Okay, then I think our work here is done for today, if there are no other questions. So again, for those who haven't gotten your office hour, if you would like, please sign up for it. And for those who have no other questions, class is dismissed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, see you next week.
Thank you,
Bye.
Kenneth.
And Andrea,
Thank you, Kenneth.
Thank you. Andrea, could you stick around for just a moment?
Enjoy your weekend, guys.
Andrea.
We don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have just a little question after everyone leaves. Yeah, it's a question.
We don't have class next week, do we?
Sorry, it's 2 weeks. Yes, you're right. Thank you for
Okay.
So a week.
Okay.
Next week is Memorial Day. The following week. So next class, I will see you next class.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Enjoy.
May I ask one quick question?
Yes, go ahead.
I just forget how many more classes we have.
After we have two more sessions after
Awesome.
Memorial Day.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, Kenneth.
Okay, thank you.